And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Okay, moving on into marine forecast, we've got here for the first surface map today showing a really washing out front here along the southwest coast, and really not much of any significant winds going on even out here over the Bering Sea. So could see 15 to 25 mile an hour winds across St. Matthew Island, but interior Alaska looking pretty light wind-wise, especially the Gulf here. Light and variable into the Panhandle, all the way up to the Arctic Ocean there. High pressure right along and just off the central Arctic coast, keeping winds light there. For tonight, not much change. Light winds interior Alaska, but ahead of this front, got gale warnings coming in here. Eastern Aleutians as this front pushes eastward, tightens the gradient up here over the eastern Bering Sea to start for tomorrow. And back to the west, winds become more westerly, say 15 to 30 miles an hour, but light winds over the interior areas as well as the Arctic coast. And then for Saturday, gale warnings up here in the northern Bering Sea, St. Lawrence Island, winds increasing in the Bering Strait with breezy conditions, but winds become lighter the farther south you go here toward the Alaska Peninsula. Light winds Gulf of Alaska and all of the southeast coast. For the marine forecast here, variable winds 5 knots for the north coast. Central coast, variable to northwest, 5 to 10 knots. Southeast at 10 there for the southern coast. Light variable winds, 5 to 10 knots over the central, all of the inside waters here with seas only at about 2 feet or less. Same forecast for Saturday. Light variable winds, 5 to 10 knots, all the inside channels. East at 10 on the south coast, central coast, northeast at 10 knots. Light variable winds on the north coast at 5 knots. And for Cook Inlet tomorrow, south to southwest winds 10 to 15 knots, southeast 15 for Kamishak Bay, and variable at 10 for the Barren Islands, North Gulf Coast, and Bristol Bay, with seas 2 to 3 feet in all those areas. And for Saturday, Cook Inlet, south to southwest breeze at 10 knots, seas 2 to 3 feet, east winds at 15 knots for Kamishak Bay, Barren Islands, east winds 15 knots. East-northeast winds, 15 knots for the North Gulf Coast. Prince William Sound, winds east at 10. And for Friday, Kodiak Island, variable to southwest winds, 10 to 15 knots. Alaska Peninsula, southeast winds, 20 to 25 knots. And Bristol Bay, southeast winds at 20 knots, with seas only at about 2 feet there. And then bring more wind in with that front coming eastward. Looking at small craft advisories for the Alaska Peninsula for south to southeast winds 25 to 30 knots first day of the weekend. East winds increasing to 30 knots for Bristol Bay. Now the sea's up to 6 feet there, 8 feet on the Pacific side of the Alaska Peninsula. Lighter winds for Kodiak Island, variable to east at 10 to 15 knots. Eastern Aleutians tomorrow, south to southeast winds 25 to 30 knots. South winds 30 knots for Adak and Atka. Southwest winds 30 knots for all of the western Aleutians. Seas running 9 to 13 feet out in that area. And for the day on Saturday, winds a little lighter out here over the western Aleutians. West to southwest 20 to 25 knots. Southwest 20 for Adak and Atka. Eastern Aleutians, southwest winds 20 to 25 knots with 5 to 8 foot seas. And for the southwest coast, small craft advisories for the day Friday, southeast 25 knots, St. Lawrence Island, winds southeast at 25 knots. Gale warnings for St. Paul, St. George, and St. Matthew Island tomorrow. Southeast winds 35 knots, seas 10 to 12 feet. And then for Saturday, of that front coming into the coast, gale warnings 40 knots in the forecast here. Yukon Delta coast, Nunivak Island, Kuskokwim Delta coast. Again, those 40-knot winds out of the southeast. Southeast winds increasing to 35 knots for St. Lawrence Island. Norton Sound also seeing winds increase to 30 knots from the southeast. Gale warnings continue for St. Matthew Island for south winds at 35 knots. South 25 for the Pribilofs. Central eastern Beaufort Sea coast, east winds tomorrow 10 to 15 knots. Southeast at 10 for the western coast. And from Wells to Cape Beaufort, southeast winds 25 knots. And then for the day Saturday, eastern Beaufort Sea coast, east winds 15 knots. Southwest 15 on the central coast, southeast 15 knots, western Arctic coast. Chukchi Sea, southeast winds 25 to 35 knots.